Hello, I'm Peter, VK3YE, and I'm going to start with a question. How many of you have ever operated HF Pedestrian Mobile? That is, carrying your antenna and your transceiver and making contacts on HF. Chances are not many hams have. In fact, most hams probably haven't even worked a pedestrian mobile station on HF. But I think you should, and here's some reasons why. It's a new challenge. You might have already made lots of contacts from home, but with pedestrian mobile, it puts a different slant on it. Then there's experimenting with antennas. Some great opportunities, including 2 antennas that I'll describe today. The novelty factor, both for yourself and most importantly, the people you contact. Very often, you'll be their first pedestrian mobile contact.
And to my QTH, the state of Georgia. Victor Kilo 3, Yankee Echo, K4 Sugar United, over. The signal strength about 5 here. If I understood you correctly, I think you said you were walking, but I'm not 100% sure of that, Peter, so you might help me out. VK3 Yankee Echo Mobile, K4 Sugar United, over. Oh my goodness, Peter, that's absolutely amazing. That is absolutely amazing. Well, congratulations. Congratulations, that's phenomenal.
You can also go places, including places away from interference like you'd get at home. That will help you hear stations better. And last but not least, you also meet interesting people while you're walking along. They might even ask you about what you're carrying, and you can strike up some interesting conversations and even help promote amateur radio. These are just a few of the joys of being HF Pedestrian Mobile. Keep listening and I'll show you how easy it is with some fairly basic antennas. On bands like 28 and 50 MHz, you can get distances up to 500 to 1,000 miles quite easily, especially in the middle of summer, where the sporadic E propagation gives you long distances even with low power. You can get similar distances on 7 MHz, even during the day. At night, distances increase with up to 1,500 to 2,000 miles quite possible, even with low power. Then there's the real DX. Between 14 and 28 MHz, you should be able to make HF Pedestrian Mobile contacts halfway around the world. I've certainly done that between Australia and Europe and the United States. Some of the stations you work will hardly believe that you are pedestrian mobile, especially if you're running QRP. As an example, during the last solar cycle, I worked a whole lot of Europeans, all in about 30 minutes, just with this small antenna while walking along the beach.
It's a Kilo 3 Yankee Echo, over.
Okay, thank you, Kilo 3 Yankee Echo. Thank you, Kilo 3 Yankee Echo. Happy there. Good morning. I'll give you 3 by 3.
As well as the antenna, you also need some form of over-the-shoulder bag to hold your transceiver and battery. I use an FT817, with the FT818 being the current model. The popular and newer ICOM 705 should also be okay, with a bit of extra transmitter power. Personally though, I prefer the shape of the FT818 and also the fact that it's got a front panel mounting antenna socket. That's a little bit easier for connections to your antenna. If you're just interested in 28 MHz, then you can also get single band 28 MHz transceivers, or even use a converted CB. That's what I actually did when I first got into pedestrian mobile and had some great success with it. As for the battery, that depends on how long you want to be able to operate between charges. The batteries that go into the FT817 aren't good enough, so I always use an external battery. I use an LI FEP04 that's at 7 amp hour, and that's more than enough. You could also use nickel metal hydride or any of the lithium type of batteries. Your amp-hour rating should be between about 3 and 7 amp-hour. That will give you a good amount of time to be operating pedestrian mobile with 5 watts of SSB. I'll run quickly through 5 pedestrian mobile antennas I've used. Later, I'll describe 2 in more detail. The smallest is this telescoping whip that extends out to almost 1.5 metres. It has a little tuned circuit at the bottom that allows it to operate on bands between 7 and 28 MHz. It's great for receiving, but for transmitting, except for 28 MHz, then this isn't the greatest choice. Here's another. It's actually a loaded dipole. The loading coils are switched in for 28 MHz, but otherwise they're switched out for 50 MHz. An antenna like this is quite good if you're operating during the summer, enjoying sporadic E-propagation on 10 and 6 metres. It's a horizontal dipole though, so is very unwieldy, and you're likely to break it unless you are in an open space. Another class of pedestrian mobile antenna, which I've had a lot of success with, is the magnetic loop. This one does 7 through to 28 MHz and is about 3 feet in diameter. This one, a bit smaller, is 21 to 50 MHz. This is one that I call the summer loop and is particularly good if you are a US technician ham who's got SSB access on 28 and 50 MHz and wants to work a bit of summer sporadic EDX. Then this antenna is super light, super small, and gives you surprisingly good performance. I've had contacts up to about 1,500 miles on 6 metres with this antenna, and on 10 metres even further. That's been just a quick run through. I'll now describe 2 in more detail. One is a magnetic loop, and the other a vertical. Here's a closer look at the summer loop. It's made of aluminium strip, about 1 inch wide and 1/8 of an inch thick, and the total length of it would be a bit over 3 feet. It's bent into an octagon. You can very easily bend that octagon just with a bit of wood, and you can kneel on that wood and then just pull the metal strip, and it's thin enough for you to bend it by hand. Now, people talk about different shapes of magnetic loops. In theory, a circle is the most efficient because it encloses the most area, but the octagon is very, very close behind, and there's really no discernible difference. There are different ways to feed magnetic loops. One common approach is to have a small loop of about 1/5 the diameter of the main loop, and that provides coupling for the 50 ohm feed line. In this case, I've used a gamma match type arrangement. You can't see because I've wrapped it up in tape, but the braid of the RG58 feed line goes to the centre of the loop, the opposite end to the split end, which I'll show you a bit more later on. Braid goes to the centre, and then you can see a bit of stiff wire goes to the inner of the feed line, and that goes to a point along the loop around 3 inches away from the centre. You might need to make some small adjustments, but if you find a point, you'll find it gives optimum low VSWR on all bands the loop covers. You can see there's a hole where I tried another position which wasn't as good. The material of this is aluminium. Copper is also good. Aluminium is slightly less conductive, but it will still be quite efficient for a loop of this nature. The most critical part of the loop is at the top. The element is split, and you can see 2 bolts which hold it tight against a piece of printed circuit board material. And the reason for that circuit board material is to hold a trimmer capacitor. This is a beehive trimmer. It may be somewhat hard to get. It goes from about 5 to 50 picofarad. There are more common beehive type trimmers that only go up to 25 picofarad, and if you were to use one of those in this loop, then the loop would be okay on 50 megahertz, but not so good on 28 megahertz. You could try connecting a small capacitor of around 27 picofarad in parallel, and then you'd be able to get the loop to operate on 21 and 28 megahertz. If you've got a small air-spaced variable capacitor, that would be fine as well. But the important thing is low resistance connections between the ends of the loop and the variable capacitor. Don't have long, thin, dangly wires. The resistance has to be the absolute lowest to ensure maximum efficiency. Supporting all that is a piece of plastic chopping board. That is helpful because I'm using that to hold the dowling, which forms the main support of the loop. You can also see I've used chopping board at the bottom of the loop for the feed line to pass through. Something else you might want to do, I mentioned the screws before. I'm using 4mm approximate diameter screws. You can see they're a bit rusted there. The good thing about that size is that banana sockets can slip over them. So if you wanted to cover a lower band, then you can put parallel capacitors there to reduce the loop's resonant frequency. You won't get as much efficiency as you would on 28 or 50 megahertz, but that is an option for other bands. So that is the summer loop. There's some demonstrations on my YouTube channel at VK3YE. It's also described on my website and also in my books. It's a very light, highly efficient, portable pedestrian mobile magnetic loop, especially for 10 and 6 meters. If you are having difficulties with getting the variable capacitor, you might want to experiment with using coax cable. That has a capacitance of around 1 picofarad per centimeter. So you might be able to make a single band magnetic loop out of that. If you had a loop that could only do, say, the SSB part of 10 meters, you could cover a couple of 100 kilohertz on that band, just with a bit of trial and error. And that might be an easier way to build a loop if you're just interested in the one band and you don't have a variable capacitor. As for adjusting the loop, well, you just tune for maximum noise on the receiver, apply a little bit of RF power. Hopefully your transceiver will have a VSWR indicator, and you should be able to get the VSWR down at 1:1. But bear in mind, these magnetic loops are quite narrow band. If you go more than, say, 100 kilohertz away, then you'll need to adjust the capacitor again. Fortunately, most activity on 10 meters SSB and 6 meters SSB is within a 100 to 200 kilohertz part of the band. If you want 7 to 14 megahertz, you could build a loop like this, but bigger, with a high value variable capacitor. That will give you great results there, and even up to 21 or even 28 megahertz. For now though, here's another antenna to consider. Here's the second antenna I'll describe in detail. It's a vertical about 5 meters long, which makes it a quarter wavelength on 14 megahertz. This is what I called the Wade tenor. So called because I usually use it when I'm walking through the water at my local beach. It's not actually solid metal, it's instead just wire, like this, insulated wire, with a loading coil halfway down the middle, and an antenna coupler. At the bottom of the 5 meter vertical wire is this L-match antenna coupler. Like all L matches, just two components: a variable capacitor with a maximum of about 200 or 250 picofarad, and a coil. This one is round on a toroid with a rotary switch to give various inductance positions. With this arrangement, the 5 metre wire will operate on all amateur bands from 10 through to 50 MHz. At the end of the matching unit is a BNC plug that plugs straight into the top of my FT817. Even if its efficiency is a bit less, 7 MHz is too good a band to miss. Consequently, I've added a loading coil. You can see the switch there. The loading coil is switched out on bands from 10 through to 50 MHz and switched in for 7 MHz. At the top of my 5 metre wire is this piece of plastic that curves around the thin end of the fishing pole and provides a tight fit that keeps the wire upright. The pole goes on the chopping board mount, which goes into the backpack, and in conjunction with your small over-the-shoulder bag, you've got the transceiver and the battery, then you're right to go pedestrian mobile. When you're packed up, you collapse the fishing pole, take the wire antenna off, and the smaller bag with the transceiver and battery, there's enough room for it to go into the backpack, so you can walk back home. Short vertical antennas without counterpoises are notoriously poor performance, particularly on lower HF. So what do? I used to use a counterpoise trailing behind me. A problem with that was it got caught up and dogs often ran after it when I was on the beach. Another problem was that depending on the sand conditions, I would often have to readjust the antenna coupler every few metres I walked if the sand characteristics changed. So something better was needed. Fortunately, near where I live, which is a bay beach, the tides aren't very variable. I can usually find a spot where the water is always between ankle and knee deep. So what I did was I made a contact ring, actually from an egg poacher that you might be able to find. They're just rings that you put in the fry pan and they help you poach your eggs. Anyway, that was made out of aluminium, so I just cut a slit in it with a saw so I could put it around my ankle, and then I used a Velcro strap to hold it down and keep it in contact with salt water. I should mention, this is no good if you're near a freshwater lake. It really does need to be salt water for best conductivity. Here's something I've noticed. If you're in contact with the ground, the noise level is higher and your transmitted signal is stronger. Here's a demo. Now some more demonstrations. First of all, this antenna, and then a larger loop, which if you're inland might be a better choice for HF Pedestrian Mobile.
I'll see if anybody else can hear you, Peter. VK3YE. This is VK3SLAK, over. VK5BJE in the Adelaide Hills.
That's really good signal, Peter. You're 5 and 5, no preamp, genuine 5 and 5.
I'm now in the water, up to my ankles, so I wonder if that's made much of a difference in the signal.
Well, Peter, it made 2 F points of difference. You went over 5 by 9 and then out of the water you're 5 by 7. Yeah, about 2 F points, Peter.
It was a very interesting experiment, Peter. I haven't got the preamp running at all, and you were 5 and 5. When you walked out of the water, it dropped down to 5 and 1. But before you came back on land, it came up again. But your signal has more punch and depth while you're in the water.
The other thing too, I suspect people wouldn't be ringing the terrorism hotline every time they see you with that magnetic loop. But now that you just look like a fisherman who's got a bag full of fish, probably in a fishing pole. So you'll blend right in, that's for sure. of X-ray. Roger, Victor Kilo 3, Yankee Echo Mobile. Well, thank you, Peter, for the nice report. You're 55 on the last over. 55 on the last over. Thank you for calling. Congratulations for the mobile setup. 7 trees and with you many more DX. VK3 Yankee Echo, the mobile. Echo Alpha 5, Delta Yankee, 7 trees.
Kilo 3 Yankee Echo Mobile, India Kilowatt 5, Sugar Radio Fox. My name is Paolo, Papa, America, Ontario, London, Ontario. Paolo is my name, and I'm located in central Italy. You got a 5x5, yeah, 55.
3, Victor Kilo 3 Yankee Echo Mobile, Sugar Mike 1, Alpha Lima Hotel. Really outstanding conditions between Australia and Sweden this morning.
Which one would I suggest? The answer is, it depends. If you're inland, then take a loop. There's a lot of benefits of that, including directionality, and you can also walk through suburban streets, making contacts without worry of it getting caught on trees or power lines. In contrast, if you're near a saltwater beach, particularly if the tide variation isn't much, then a vertical like the Raid tenor might be a better choice, especially if you want something that does all bands from 7 through to 50 MHz. On the other hand, if you're just interested for something on the higher HF bands, then something like this small loop is a great choice, whether you're inland or on the beach. I've given a few ideas on pedestrian mobile antennas. They're simple and cheap to build. You can make them even simpler and cheaper if you make them single band only. My choices for great pedestrian mobile bands include 10 metres, which you can do with a small loop like this, 40 metres, or if you're really into competitive DX, then 20 metres when conditions are right. Put 1 or 2 pedestrian mobile antennas together and you too can have some great results, even with QRP. Not only will you get a buzz, but also the station's working you.
Pedestrian mobile walking along the beach. My goodness, that's fantastic. All of this.
For more information on all this, visit my website VK3YE.com. I've also written 2 top-selling books on portable antennas: hand-carried QRP antennas and more hand-carried QRP antennas. Both are available for $5 US as e-books or a bit more in paperback. And for beginners to ham radio, check out Ham Radio Get Started. You might also suggest it to friends who might also be thinking of getting into amateur radio. It's very practically oriented and talks about the equipment, antennas and operating that you need to get the most out of amateur radio. All are $5 ebooks, with paperback also available. More information on my website, VK3YE.com, or search their titles on Amazon. Thank you for watching, and I'll be around for the Q&A session. You can also watch my videos on YouTube, just search VK3YE, and there's a playlist all about HF Pedestrian Mobile.